And it's very easy to get trapped in, the sort of burnout cycle of working the very long hours to get it stood up. And then you take a break after the project, maybe even between companies. That's when you're taking your break, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than learning how to build in breaks so that you can have some longevity.
The deadlines are pressing, the team you manage is panicking, and your leadership has high expectations for your work. How do you stay calm so you can manage it all effectively? On today's episode of That's a Great Point, we have special guest Tom Carpenter. Tom helped NBC win an Emmy for his work hosting the Olympics. Tom is also responsible for managing teams who helped to launch Disney+. Tom shares his insight into managing large groups of people to work together as a cohesive unit, staying calm under pressure, noticing the signs of burnout, and managing the stress of your team and yourself. If you manage people, this episode is absolutely for you. If you find our content helpful, please share it with somebody. That's how you can help support the show. Thanks for playing along. Enjoy. Welcome to That's a Great Point, the attitude adjustment for your soul, where co-hosts Alina Doran, Michelle Albers, and Lee Smart discuss deep topics around a life well lived. Let's start the show.
I'm excited to have Tom Carpenter join us today.
I'm excited to be here.
That's it. No, I'm just kidding. Tom, I love the topic that we're going to talk about. Tom is a wonderful, amazing guest to have to talk about leading under pressure. He has led under pressure many times on projects that a lot of our viewers will recognize the end result. One of them was the launch of Disney Plus that we worked on together. More recently, do you want to talk about your Emmy winning work?
Oh, yeah, I did win an Emmy. I was part of lucky to be part of the NBC team that put on the Paris Summer Olympics. So that was quite something. So yeah, I'm an Emmy winning producer.
Yeah.
That sounds cool.
Also the sailing and surviving the Bermuda Triangle. So leading under pressure in many different circumstances, business, literally life and death. Tom also manned a suicide hotline. And that is also very much leading under pressure, where how you respond and don't respond and what you do can make the difference between the person hanging up or staying online, hopefully long enough to change their mind.
Get help. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Where do you want to start? Where do we go?
Well, we were just talking about this. When we think about the leading under pressure, where does that pressure come from? The first place is there's a deadline. Okay.
Yeah.
But the rest.
So most of my career has been centered around launching new media technology, going all the way back to some of the very first websites. But the last, I'd say 15 years in particular around streaming. So you mentioned Disney Plus. Anytime you have new technology, inherently there's risk, right? You're doing something that hasn't been done before. In a way, you could almost say you're doing the impossible, right? It wasn't possible before you did it. So right off the bat, that's a source of pressure. How do you do that, right? How do you manage the risk inherent to new technology? And there's also no such thing as a project that doesn't have some kind of deadline, right? So you're always going to be under that kind of pressure. For the streaming media in particular, these are very, very large public-facing projects. So I launched streaming for MTV, was the head of operations to stand up Epix, which then became MGM Plus and was bought by Amazon. And then, of course, working with you, launched first ESPN Plus and then Disney Plus around the world. So all of these projects are always going to have, some kind of deadline that's been imposed on them, some kind of market target you're trying to hit, right, to get out in the wild. Another aspect to these things is these are very large enterprise initiatives. So you're working with a lot of different teams. And that means inherently there are going to be a lot of different agendas and a lot of different, chemistry and all kinds of interesting dynamics, right? With the group you're trying to pull together to get this thing out the door. So right off the bat, there are a lot of potential pressure sources, I would say, right there.
Right. And when what you're talking about, sure, there's external deadlines. And when you're working with other people to get a thing done, whatever that thing is, public facing, life saving, and anything in between, you also have personalities in the room.
Absolutely.
And so you have folks who are the internal pressure that we're all putting on ourselves in how we are supposed to show up, expectations that we have for how we are to be experienced in the room by others.
That's
right? There's
right.
Egos fill the room and bump up against each other, kind of pressurizing the environment more.
And everyone deals with stress or pressure differently too, right? And I would even go so far as to say that there are stereotypes among different types of groups. So like QA, you can generalize. There's certain, there's a mindset to QA, right? There's a mindset to engineering.
QA, quality assurance.
Quality assurance. Sorry, stop me if I use an acronym. I mean, each one of these departments or teams is going to inherently have their own almost personality, right? And so how do you bring all that together? How do you get, bridge the divide between people that literally think differently about and see the world a little differently, right? And then part of the fun of Disney Plus was we were literally going around the world. So we were dealing with different global cultures as we went, right? And with every single launch, to some degree, we had to work with the local market. Some were more involved than others. Some were more technical than others. But to some degree, we always had to, reach out and work with the local market. And that was interesting too, because that literally could be a different culture, in different languages, all kinds of interesting aspects. So how do you bridge all these different divides? Right. And especially how do you do it the first time? The first one's always the hardest. After we'd been doing it for a while, you and I think, came to a point where we almost had like a template for these things.
A playbook.
A playbook, exactly. But how do you do the first one?
It's always the first, second one, right? It's always jumping in.
The first 10, but definitely the first one. I think when you're, dealing with personalities, when you're trying to, really when you're launching, you're asking something of all these teams, right? You're trying to get something from all these teams. All these teams have to contribute in some way to the success of the project. And many times, if you're sort of a ringleader like I was, or in one of these central kind of hub positions, you're going to be asking them for status. You're going to be asking them for, issues, things that might not be comfortable to answer, right? You're putting them on the spot in a lot of ways, or you easily could be perceived as doing so. So one thing that always helps is to come with an olive branch, right? Bring something, give something back before you ask something. Each one of these groups are going to have their own challenges. And so there's always a way you can find to help them out, right? So you're not just coming in asking things, you're bringing something to them. And that's a great way to sort of start that relationship. It's a great way to bring them to the table, to help them feel invested. It's really a classic project management trick. When you're a project manager, you're going around pestering people for status and all kinds of things. But, if a great way to start that relationship is to bring something to them. How can I help you? And looking around the organization, it's not usually too hard to see what these different groups might need help with. I was coming from a technology background, so that's the easiest thing. I can help them understand the technology. Most of these groups are not technical groups necessarily. There were a lot of marketing teams. There was legal, all kind of customer service, right? People that might not be technical. So right off the bat, if you can help them understand some of the technology of the platform or the terminology, that's a great way to, start off a relationship and bring kind of an olive branch.
Yeah. Well, I love that if we're looking at sort of the through line and zoom out, right? Whatever that particular, project that's being worked on, whatever the initiative, wherever it is, whatever, whether it's an office building or at home,
Yeah.
it's you're coming in to a pressurized environment that breeds mistrust, right?
Yep.
That breeds competing egos, right? There's pressure that's coming from the inside, that's pressure that's coming from the outside.
Yep.
And one of the ways that we're leading, that's what you're talking about, is finding a through line and a commonality and building safety by offering help.
Yep. Absolutely.
Right. And showing some humanity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just even, yeah, exactly. Showing empathy, right? The basics of any human relationship, right? You can bring that to the business context as well. 100%. And then as you get experience through your career and working with these different types of groups, like I said, each team is going to have almost their own personality, and you can start to recognize these things over time. The mindset of the engineer versus the mindset of the quality assurance technician, and so that helps you too as you go. That's not something you're going to have out of the gates early in your career, but over time you start to recognize the patterns, and understand almost the personality types of these different groups. And then of course they're executives, and they're going to have their own needs and demands they're going to be putting on you. And, you can, but the same goes, if you can understand what, they have pressure on them too. Right. So if you can understand what's pressurizing them, what their, what their stressors are, then you can help, them and respond to that appropriately. Communication obviously is up there. Being clear, being concise, and really ideally over time, you want to become a trusted source. I would always rather come in as a trusted source kind of leader rather than an authoritarian voice, right? Like if people over time can understand that, I know what I'm talking about and they can trust me, and I'm going to always try to give the best guidance in any particular situation. That to me is so much better a way to come into a room or a meeting or, one of these 100-person Zoom calls we used to have, rather than coming in trying to, bark orders at someone. I would say earlier in my career, I absolutely had a much more authoritative leadership style, where I was acting off of, authority that I was granted rather than earned. And, that's a learning process, right? It was almost like the militaristic style, right? You like hear your orders, you do because I say.
Right. The hammer approach, right? The hammer approach works temporarily, and then inevitably it has an expiration date.
Yeah. And
right. Or something breaks.
Yeah. And it's going to carry a very different kind of energy too, right? And you're going to have very different kinds of relationships with colleagues or subordinates, with that kind of leadership style.
The word resentment comes up for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And when I was younger in my career, I didn't know any better. Right. But I think over time I learned that, you can lead with empathy and consensus building, and, many times I think you can achieve much better results. Right.
But
the idea of the trusted voice, I like to think that when I came on these very sort of high energy, high sense of urgency types of calls we would have, and a lot of this we were doing remote. It was during the pandemic. Like I said, you could easily have a call with 100 people on it or more. all participating in this project in some level, and a full range too, right? Executives all the way, engineers, all types, different types on there. And, over time, I would like to think that I was able to get to a place where having my voice on the call was a source of calm.
That's right. And it was, right? It was. And it's, right. It's so important in a room where others might be feeling unsteady and shaky.
Yeah.
Right. To be that person. And it's interesting that that's a common thread in the work that I'm doing now with folks in succession planning, right? Planning for like being trained for the CFO role, CEO role, and that calm under pressure.
Yeah.
Calm, steady when somebody throws something at you. The folks that I'm working with, it's interesting, different companies, different engagements, very, very different personalities, and different roles, of course. And they're wonderful at presenting. They're wonderful coming into a room, very high pressure, and being on the spot and presenting the idea beautifully.
Mm-hmm.
The next part is where they get questions asked, right? It's where something's thrown at them that they may not have been prepared for. And how do they handle that? Do they stay steady on their feet?
Sure.
Right. And that's one of the traits that we're working on with a professional who's being groomed for the CEO role is someone throws a ball at you, how do you catch it calmly? And if you don't catch it, how do you stay cool and collected and spacious, right? Spacious and nimble on your feet.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting. I'm curious about, we're talking about the, practical aspect of it. I'm curious about the energetic aspect of staying calm in ambiguity, in all of that uncertainty, and what happens within.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about this a little bit before. I think there's so much to be said for tone, right? And just delivery. It's almost the McLuhan idea of the medium is the message, right? Like how you deliver can be almost as important as the actual content of your delivery. People talk about things like energy mapping, like if you're coming on with like a frantic, person, if be it like a therapy session or really any kind of communication, like matching their energy level and then trying to adjust from there. That's a technique that's useful. That's something that we actually used on the crisis hotline. But I almost like to do it the other way, right? If you're coming into a panicky room, high energy room, coming in with the calm, thoughtful, very paced dialogue, right? Not coming in with that energy mapping, energy matching type of, frantic sense. People respond to that usually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not, matching frantic wavelengths create more of it, right? And then coming in as a contrasting, soothing voice of reason is a powerful thing. I'm
carrying confidence in your voice, right? People can tell if you're confident or not. Just like you can usually tell if someone's a bit panicked. And unfortunately, it would be very common on some of these calls to hear panic in people. For many of these launches, there was at least some component that people on the call had never done before. And that's scary, right? And even after we'd done a lot of these launches, for the local market people, it was going to be new for them because they hadn't launched in their market yet, right? So that's always scary. And we're launching for, their customers in a sense, so they're going to be heavily invested in that.
very.
And right off the bat, you have to build that trust. Like we're not going to come in and have a bad launch for you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
We know what we're doing, and there are ways you can convey that with tone.
And that's it. And again, for the folks tuning in who may not be familiar with, or their world is outside of streaming launches, thinking about the through lines and some of the wisdom and the learnings that we have from those experiences of coming into a room where folks don't know,
Yep,
are scared,
yep,
right? Or apprehensive, or don't trust you, or what are you doing here?
And I get it. If you're a marketing person, you don't have a streaming media technology background to understand what we're doing. And yet you're responsible for promoting the efforts of this highly complex technical project with a lot of different moving pieces, right? So that, I get it. That's a scary area to operate in, when you're promoting something that you don't understand necessarily the basics of. And you can't expect everyone to understand it, especially being new media technology, right? Even the people working on it aren't going to understand every aspect. I think another interesting through line is, even the first launch, I hadn't done that before, but I'd done other launches, right? So after you get a few of these types of projects under your belt, there's a lot of commonality, right? I mentioned risk management. There's always going to be risk management. No matter what the project is, there should always be some phase where there's an exercise where you call out all the things that could potentially go wrong. And as you said before, you can run book those things. You can playbook those things, right? So even the first Disney Plus launch, even though we hadn't done it yet, we could still call out a lot of the potential risks and build plans around.
Right. There's what there's what you know you don't know, right? And then there's what you don't know that you don't know that's out there.
The unknowns.
Always, right. Unknowns. You just know that they exist and not knowing. I'm thinking about character. It's almost like diamonds and under pressure. And I'm thinking about how folks will say that pressure builds character.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think it reveals it. Pressure reveals character, doesn't necessarily build it. You don't get to see what you're made of. You think of yourself like you have a persona. Or maybe others around you have told you how they experience you, and that built your perception of who you think you are. And it's when, put the metal, the pedal to the metal. It's when the rubber hits the road. Insert your favorite metaphor. It's when you're in it and under pressure that you realize what you're really made of. When people are in crisis and they perform heroic acts, and others will come to them afterwards and hail them as a hero, and they'll say, I just did the right thing. I just did what made sense.
Right.
There was no world where I wouldn't have done that.
It's a little bit like, to a fireman, a fire is not an emergency, right?
Right.
It's just a job or a project.
Right. We see them as heroes. They see it as, I'm going to work.
Exactly. So I think in a similar way, most of my career, I come from sort of a technical operations position with respect to these projects. And if you're in operations, you're a fireman. I mean, and you're dealing with issues and incidents constantly. And if you think about them as emergencies, then you're going to be, off your kilter. You're not going to, but if it's just another incident, it's just be triaged and managed.
That's right. I'm curious about times when you were off your kilter.
Well, the first of everything is always tough, right? I learned a lot about how to successfully manage an enterprise level project by having a front row seat to one that failed rather spectacularly. The first one I worked on, when I was, literally my first technical job, I would say, I was part of a project that just went off the rails. It went way beyond deadline. It went way beyond budget. It was encountering all kinds of technical issues and failures. And that was a great learning experience. I learned how not to do a project.
What a gift.
Right?
What a gift when it goes wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you can always
Well,
take away learnings. Like,
that's
and
right. No, it's
that
so
got me my
true.
next job, right? That got me, I was able to
Absolutely.
say, hey, I know how these things fail, so I am pretty confident I can, you know, project how not to have it fail, and bring that to it. Um, but yeah, it's always, I would say another, when we went into the sort of uh, relentless march of all the launches we did during the pandemic.
Yeah.
That can be trying. It could be 80-hour weeks.
Yeah.
We were all locked down. We weren't getting exercise. I probably wasn't even eating very well. Definitely not getting enough sleep.
Yeah.
Not getting sunshine and daylight. Living in Manhattan in a tiny New York City apartment. Not being able to get out for walks and this kind of thing. In retrospect, there are a lot of things I could have done, but we just didn't know, the disease vectors. We didn't know like how to manage that risks. And so I think between all those things, it's very easy to get into a place where you could be facing burnout. I've encountered that at various points in my career, enough that I can recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely a place where, you're not on an even keel, right? And I think when you get into that kind of headspace, it can also very easily lead to poor decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, I
yeah,
I love that you're talking about, I'm imagining a pressure valve,
yeah,
right? And it's maxing out. It's maxing out and the lid's about to pop off,
yeah.
right? The total breakdown. So taking down one notch at a time doesn't need to be something dramatic. Anything to take the pressure down impacts the ability to handle what happens in the world, because it's really your nervous system is what's walking
Oh
into
yeah,
the room and runs the system, right? Your nervous
absolutely.
system runs that system. So unless you know how to lead yourself first and regulate your nervous system,
Yep,
it's bad news bears.
absolutely. And the body has a limit to how much stress it can absorb.
Yeah.
Um, I've had panic attacks, and if you have a panic attack, to me, that's literally your body just telling you that it's beyond that limit of how much stress it can absorb.
Yeah. And
Uh,
yes, and different bodies,
yeah,
different people will have different responses.
absolutely.
Um, I um, I was I was at an event a few weeks ago. Ran into this gentleman who was a partner at an accounting
Mhm.
firm. He switched accounting firms because one that he was at was toxic and not only pressurized from the nature of work, but from what was created by the people who worked in that company. That didn't have to happen. He shared with me a photograph of the top of his head. And then he showed me, it was like the before and the after. He
Mm.
has a lot more hair now, visibly more hair on his head.
Yeah.
And I thought that he was about to tell me that he took a trip to, one of the countries that does low cost hair transplant surgeries that have been all the rage, apparently. No, he did not have any procedures. He switched companies.
He changes environment.
He's a partner. He's still a partner. So still deadlines, still lots of work, right? Still responsibility. He's in a place of way less toxicity. People are making different choices and leading and showing up differently. He regrew hair,
Amazing.
visible, very obvious. I couldn't believe it. And it was less than a year apart, the two pictures. It's unbelievable. Oh yeah. I mean, people have sudden, weight loss, their immune system breaks down. We've all
Yeah.
been there. So I appreciate that you're bringing up
But
the physical breakdown.
yeah, I think it's so important to be cognizant of that. Again, back to, these projects are going to have enough stressors already built in. And then if you start running people, if you're not managing the team resources of the project effectively, or the timelines effectively, and you have to ask people to start working extra hours and weekends and this kind of thing, you have to be conscious that that's going to have an impact on people and their ability to absorb the stress. And eventually, if it keeps going, ultimately, their ability to make sound decisions even, right? So that you have to be aware of that kind of thing as a leader. Be aware of what you're asking people to do, and the impacts of that, right?
Yeah. I see, Lee, there's been a lot brewing. I'm curious what's on your mind, Lee.
Oh man, I've got 1,000 things on my head. We started off with like individual egos versus collective egos versus how do I fit my own ego into the collective and the rest of the individuals. That was a really great point that you made there, Tom, about like in my words, force breeds resistance. By the laws of nature. When you come in with force, it's going to be resisted.
Yeah.
So getting on somebody else's side is phenomenal. But I'm curious, like this inner landscape thing. This is my forte. How do we manage our own inner landscape? And I'm curious for you where the distinction is between pressure and stress, or maybe even like eustress and de-stress.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And it's challenging because you're not always going to be aware of how much stress your body's experiencing, right? It's you might be aware of the pressures on you, but it takes a lot to really be aware of how much stress you're in. And here again, the first time I had a panic attack was that, like, I almost want to say level setting, but that like recognition, like, oh, wait a minute, my body's been under way more stress than I was acknowledging, right? And so, I hate to equate it to the first big project, but like the first time you have a panic attack, that could be a learning experience too, right? As I said, that's your body telling you, whoa, we're way too stressed out here. Like you need to make some changes. So it can be very, very challenging to recognize that stress. But I think if you talk the pressures of a project, you have to appreciate that is going to stress you. And here again, you have to understand the stress that you might be putting on other people too, as a leader, and be aware and mindful of that. I think, there's a lot you can do to process stress, obviously, all the classic, like how you're eating, how you're sleeping, how you're exercising, even just simple things, getting out and getting sunlight. But depending on the type of project you're on, there might not be a lot of, free time to do those kinds of things. Right.
Yeah.
So here again, it's almost a budgeting exercise, right? Or literally a budgeting exercise, to make sure you're budgeting out time, and for other people too, that, people can address their, non-project needs. Like people have families, people have, you need to allow people to, deal with the stress in ways they need to, if that means like not working on weekends, or, for some of these big projects, it's very easy to get into a mode where you feel like you're behind, or everyone's behind, and then everyone's all of a sudden working long hours, and it can't, those kinds of things can snowball, right? And there's going to be an impact on morale, and all these things are related. When you have morale impacted, that's going to add to stress, and that's going to add to poor decision making, and it's very easy for these things to snowball if you're not mindful, right? A series of bad decisions can make a project go from, a questionable state to a worse state, to a state that starts to feel like an emergency, right? So, all these things, and here again, if you've had the, benefit of being on a few of these before, you can recognize the warning signs. in individuals, in teams, in the project itself, right? There are warning signs on every level that you can recognize with experience to address these things before they get to that
Right.
seemingly emergency state, or the very high risk state.
Oh, I love that we're talking about being mindful of others, of deadlines, of burnout and crashing out.
Yep.
And we are so accustomed to and trained to power through everything. And
Yeah.
it's a source of pride for so many people, right? You power through. One of my bosses introduced me with great pride to someone, as, "This is Alina. She can walk through walls."
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was very like, it was a high compliment for him to make. He's a former military person, so it was a great compliment. Like, she can, and that was my source of pride, right? I can get through anything, and I'm not alone in that. I know that, and so people won't notice too often that they're breaking, that something's wrong. And when they're not noticing that something's breaking within, they're less likely to notice when their teammates are breaking. And if you're that leader and you're powering through and grinding because that's what you know, you're not seeing the suffering and the hurt that other people
100%.
have. And they may not then feel comfortable to come to the leader and say, I'm going to take a breather.
100%. Especially coming from the perspective of operations teams, there's typically a lot of pride
Oh, yeah.
in how durable, how hardcore you can be,
Yeah,
right?
durable,
Yeah.
right? Like a piece of equipment. That's right.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And here again, as a leader, it's so important to be aware of not only what you're asking people, but the example you're setting, right? Are you taking breaks yourself, right? Or, it's very tempting as a leader, a well-intentioned leader, to want to be in the trenches, right? To want to be going through everything that you're asking other people to do, right? And that's a good instinct, but I think it's maybe even more important to make sure that you're setting a good example and taking care of yourself, right? To your point, Lee, mindful of what you're going through and creating examples so people don't feel like they need to one up each other on how hardcore they are, right?
Yeah, getting unstuck from the whole need to be seen as idea.
Yeah,
I got to make sure they see me a certain way, or else,
yeah,
I'm not worthy.
absolutely, absolutely. And in operations, that's typically like, how hardcore are you, right? How durable, right, Alina, are you? So I think that's, like, here again, something that I learned, by going through it the wrong way, probably. There's so many things you learn from doing it wrong and from the mistakes. That's definitely one of them.
Yeah, it's no measure of success to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
to be healthy, to be a real true leader, you have to go against the grain many, many times.
Yep. Yeah. And I think there's something to be said for consistency. My career has really, in a lot of ways, been almost a story of successive burnouts, right? Like, I'll do one of these really hardcore enterprise projects. It's usually a year to design and stand it up, and a year to sort of operationalize it, right? And solidify it in the market. And it's very easy to get trapped in, the sort of burnout cycle of working the very long hours to get it stood up. And then you take a break after the project, maybe even between companies. That's when you're taking your break, right? Rather than learning how to build in breaks so that you can have some longevity with some of these things.
That's right. Renewable energy.
Yes, exactly.
Renewable energy and sustainability is not just an external environment concept. It's very much very much an imperative, because that's exactly what we're talking about. And that's how often folks will take the time only for when they're between jobs
Exactly.
to
Exactly.
reassess.
And I'll fully admit that that's if you look at my resume, that's clearly a trap that I've fallen into over the years. I think one of the most recent things I've learned about being a leader is that point about consistency. That's perhaps one of the most important leadership traits. And you can interpret that in a lot of different ways, but certainly one is sustainability and how you're conducting yourself, taking care of yourself, doing your work hours, this kind of thing. That's been a fairly recent learning, I would say, for me.
Can you imagine? You mentioned firemen earlier.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if our firemen or our surgeons showed up as cooked as most middle management shows up?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for someone like a fire person, like if they make a bad decision, that can literally be injury or life or death, right?
Mhm.
I always joke that the reason I work in media is because if we mess up, no one's dying on the operating table.
Right.
It might feel like it, or your fans might act like it if your show goes down or something, or they can't watch the game that you're streaming. But no one's dying. But in some of those other professions, yeah, if they're not dealing with burnout, if they're not dealing with stress management, it literally can be injury or peril of life. So I think it's healthy to still approach it with that level of seriousness, right? And that level of investment and self-care and care of your colleagues. Especially if you are in a position to be acting as a leader, for one or more of these teams.
I think this subject is as relevant as ever. What we're talking about, self-fortification and sustainability in, the economy's in flux. We're out of, the COVID world where there was a great deal of languishing. People's mental health was not doing well. There wasn't full-on depression, though it was for many, but it was a state of just a long period of feeling very, very down and depleted. And now with AI, the fear of, what's happening to people's jobs, geopolitical circumstances, all of that, there is no shortage of pressure in this world that is being placed on us externally. And I think one of the gifts of all of the circumstances that have happened in the last 5 years and continuing to reveal themselves are they're illustrating the importance of that sustainability, that it used to be a very woo-woo topic, very fringe, very yoga retreat. And now it's a much more commonly adopted language. Concepts that are not scary to people. They're much more present in environments that used to look kind of dismiss that concept. And that's the environment where I think both of us come from professionally, and maybe you too.
Plus the social unrests, right? Like you can't be so negligent as to think that these things don't affect everyone, right? And in my case, I will absolutely admit I'm still dealing with, psycho-emotional, effects from the pandemic. I'm certainly still dealing with a few physical effects, even, from just not getting the exercise and this kind of thing, and not being a young, sprightly lad as I was, a couple decades ago. So I think it's, to your point, critical that we acknowledge these things. And when we're talking, jobs and projects and leadership, we can't be so naive as to think they don't affect our teammates, our employees. These things absolutely do have an impact. And maybe the folly, to your point, was thinking that there was ever a time when they didn't. There always been external factors and scary things happening in the political world, right? All the way back, I remember in the 80s, we used to have nuclear drills where we'd hide under our desks in the schoolrooms, right? Like, so there's probably always been factors like that, to be aware of that could be affecting your employees, and this kind of thing. And I think as a leader, you need to acknowledge that it's not enough to just refer people to HR or whatever. It's important that you be willing to have human conversations, human and humane conversations with, if it's your colleagues or your teammates or your subordinates or whatever it may be. I think that's another learning over the years. I used to be very sort of professionally curt, I will say, and not warm or open to inviting a lot of personal conversations into the workplace. I think that's been a big change where, again, to your point of the human relationship factor, Alina, earlier, it's important that you are asking people how their family is, how these other things are that a couple decades ago I wouldn't have thought, germane or professional to bring into the conversation. But we are people, right? And we are people, many of us with families or other things going on outside the office that are important to acknowledge and be aware of. I think that's absolutely part of it too. You're not just leading the project, you're leading people, right?
Absolutely. And that separation, like there used to be a separation of this is how, I put on my mask, I put on my shield,
Yep.
I put on my costume, I come to work.
Yep.
At work, I am tough. At work, it's all about work.
Yep.
And that meant a complete and total wall between yourself and others. And we're just going to focus on getting things done.
Yeah, I absolutely. And I dare say, I think that was one of the maybe few, but one of the positive things to come out of the pandemic, right? That broke down. Like in the beginning, we're all on these Zoom calls, these Teams calls, these video calls, right? And if someone's kid ran into the frame, it'd be, oh my God, I'm so sorry, or someone's cat walked across the keyboard, right?
That's right.
Like, oh my God, sorry. After, a couple of months, it was like, oh, let me see your kid. Let me see. Is that your cat? Let me see your cat. Like bring your dog in. Like, you wanted to. And
it's
nice.
Yeah.
Again, humane,
absolutely. Reaction. Right. Like, oh, you're sitting in your living room and right. Yeah. We're all squishy humans.
Yeah, like
getting things done together.
Kid ran across the background. I was like, oh my God, but then after a while, I was like, oh, fun. Let me see your kids. That's great. I love it. Let me see your family. And so I think we came back from a pandemic with a lot more openness to that kind of thing, and us allowing people to just actually be people and not just, like you said, employees with that mask on. Only doing the work, that an acknowledgement of the human non-work parts of our lives, right?
And that's been one of the greatest learnings is I used to focus on efficiency, right? Like we have X number of things to get done. This is the deadline. You have a matrix. You have the delivery plan, and let's get going. And what I used to underestimate grossly was how important setting the container is, right? Creating a container of trust, that spaciousness. The spaciousness in the beginning gives tenfold down the road, right? Absolutely. Creating that trust, that container of intentionality, where people feel psychologically safe, where they're coming in and they understand the context, they understand the bigger picture, to the extent you're able to share that with them. So they're not sitting in isolation, just being given a task. There's a lot more motivation and investment. I grossly underestimated how important that is. All of that, bringing forth the humanity first, slowing down to then speed up.
Yep.
Is so critical. And it's such an important learning.
And again, it all comes back to relationships, right?
Always.
Everything comes back to relationships, as we said kind of at the top, and being open or even outreaching, being curious to bring in those non-work components. Like, tell me about your kids, how was your weekend? Like things that, again, I used to, brush off, and not think were appropriate for the workplace, a couple decades ago, say.
Yeah.
But bringing that in is a great way to strengthen that relationship, right? A great way to add layers to it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost, hate to say another tool in the toolbox, but certainly an important component, I would say, of leading through relationships.
Mm-hmm. That was one of the greatest benefits of the pandemic, is it helped us to realize how important human connection is.
Absolutely.
A friend of mine and I were just talking about this the other day. We were talking about, what is the purpose of life?
Yep.
It's not to check off the fucking to-do list, that's for sure.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's like, yeah, my life would not have nearly the kind of joy in it and if I didn't have the human connection that I had.
Absolutely.
Like all my favorite memories are with people.
Mm-hmm. 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 It's the mission, right? You're whether it's a work mission or life mission, really, and hopefully your work mission fits into the bigger why of how, when you look back on your life, when it's all said and done, it lines up and makes sense, and you're glad you did it, and you're glad that you were there.
And maybe that's a nice kind of way for us to close this out a little bit. When I think about all these projects, I don't remember the technology. I remember the people, right? I remember working with you, Alina. I remember working with the team. I remember the late nights in the conference room with the people that I was with, and on the output side of it, of what you're working on, one of my favorite moments was when we did the surprise launch in the Netherlands, and I just got to see the joy on people's faces. There were Disney fans, right? They got to stream this wonderful product. That was what I took out of it. Not, again, the technology or the project, like the result, the human result of what we did, right? And the human experience of doing it with my colleagues.
Yes. I love that. And that's a wonderful memory. And I will share one along similar lines a little bit differently. Working across we were launching globally across EMEA, Latin America. Those are the areas where we work together, and across cultures and global teams, and social norms vary. And there were so many through lines that clearly reinforce over and over how similar we are, no matter where we live, how old we are. Everybody was, had restless children who they really wanted to give something to quality to watch.
Yep. Exactly.
Everybody, whether it was their own or nephew or niece, everybody was tired. Everybody could, we could find humor even with a cultural divide, laugh at ourselves, laugh together and get things done together in a very human, vulnerable way.
100%. Yeah. My favorite moments in my career there were those kinds of things, right? Like when we did the surprise launch of Frozen 2. And I was able to text my, friends with kids and be like, hey, we got a surprise for you. Check it out. Right. Like those kinds of moments. Right. So again, that was the result of a big project, but the project parts and the technology parts are not the parts that, bring me joy and satisfaction. It's the look on kids' faces. Right. It's the mothers saying, oh my gosh, like when we launched Mandalorian, and my Star Wars fan friends were like, oh my gosh, that's so cool what you guys did. Right. Like that's the return. That's the memory. That's the purpose of these things for me.
Hell cool. Yeah. Yep. I felt like a perfect place to close her up.
Well, listen,
Tom,
guys,
appreciate you having you on, man.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to That's a Great Point with Alina Doran, Michelle Albers, and Lee Smart. To find out more about how we can serve you, check out our links in the show description. Thanks for playing along.